Hello, welcome to the exploration of the strategy implementation project. Going through the guidelines again, in this class, in this assignment rather, you are drawing on Buell, Marzano, vocabulary, and the text within our class to provide a rationale and instructional path for teaching demanding text in your subject area. Then you're going to describe the reading abilities and the range of the class you are student teaching. You're going to talk with your students, ask them to write for you about what is most difficult for them about the subject you're teaching, and what did you learn from them? How would you assess the motivation of your students in this class? And how can you know if students have understood the reading and or assignments other than by tests? Everyone signs up for a strategy that will be taught to your small group, and you're supposed to include a photocopied short reading that you will use with the strategy for everyone in class. One note, if you are using, like I am in this example, a visual text, then you can just include the link. Also, you will include a handout, which lists the name, source, and key points of the strategy, and notes what subjects could use the strategy. You point out the academic language. You show how to get the students to use the academic language. You take us through your goal in using the strategy, how you implemented it, the results, and what you would do differently, and then talk about the advantages of the strategy. So let's look at an example, which takes these concepts, these directives rather, and spaces them out. So your handout, for example, you want it to be geared towards your students. So if it doesn't make sense to include the key points of the strategy for your students, well then include them in your paper. Here's an example. So here's my name, of course, the class, the date, the title of the work, and then going through what my rationale and instructional path is. So I talk through the strategies from Buell, how Buell offers research-based strategies for supporting the literacy development, particularly in the area of reading for secondary learners, and talking about Buell's three-phase organizational framework for how those strategies are provided in the text. Using that, I then identify, so what's my goal? What's my learning outcome? And here you can see that I've written that in, my learning outcome for this task. And then I describe what we've done up until this point. So trying to get to articulating the interplay of the social, political, and technical dimensions of literacy development, we've done some work as far as the 30 million word gap, read criticism of that terminology and concept. We read research-based strategies on vocabulary instruction, talked about other things that we've engaged in, such as an analysis of academic discourse, recording non-traditional discourse, all the things that we've done to prepare for a reading of Do You Speak American, Aquila and the Bee, and in this handout that I'll be discussing, or could have been given to you, is also Key and Peele, the phone call, which has a great example of code switching. So in my second paragraph, I talk about the strategy that I've chosen, structured note-taking. And in this use of that strategy, I want the students, you, to define a concept. I want you to indicate the cause and effect of code switching in use, and identify the similarities and differences between three texts that depict the same phenomenon. Students, you, will find the similarities between two fictional texts and one documentary text. And in this case, remember, I'm using visual texts. So I want to push you to think that, all of these strategies can be applied to visual texts as well, or texts that the students are receiving through auditory means. Going through, and in my use of the structured note-taking, I also want you to be using academic conversation strategies and skills, because it's something that we've talked about in the class, and of course, because you are graduate students, you can do multiple tasks at once. So in this case, this activity, is best suited to graduate students, as the literacy tasks, the literacy demands are dynamic, interconnected, and reliant on individual higher order thinking and collaboration with peers in the meaning making. So in the structured note-taking activity that I'm going to show you in a moment, you have to do paired conversation, you have to define code switching within those pairs, you have to unpack the visual text in reference to the questions, understand those questions, of course, discuss with one another using academic conversation skills, write your responses, and then share the key ideas with the group. It's a lot. These are significant literacy demands, but they're appropriate for graduate students. So because it doesn't quite work within this context or within my purpose to identify the key points of the strategy on the handout, what I've decided to do was to put it within the rationale. So I go through those key points of a strategy. Aids in guiding comprehension during and after the reading must clearly state the text frame, so that's really important. In this case, we're talking about cause and effect, similarities and differences. It's also definition. So it may begin with a conceptual definition on that. May be used as a study guide. So structured note-taking may help with studying later. It can be used in pairs to support reading, rereading, and discussion. This strategy in particular requires that you are able to look at the page and be able to locate and organize spatially and logically. And so it really depends and connects to multiple intelligences, which is Howard Gardner. You may have been exposed to that research and those practices in your social psych class. It also can be used to verbalize your understanding. So in this strategy, in the handout that I'll show you in a moment, it's supposed to guide you through paired conversations and then lead into a whole group discussion that uses the academic language. This strategy aids in providing students with examples of organizing strategies. So dependent upon how this works for you as an organizing strategy, looking at one text in comparison to another, this may be something that you adopt in your own practice, but also in what you do as an individual student. So it may be something that you use with your students as a teacher, but it could also be something that you use in your work as a student. And students, you should be able to see relationships between concepts. In this case, you're actually looking for relationships between code switching, with code switching across experiences. Another part of the requirements of the task is that you identify the subject areas that can use this strategy. In this case, it's all subject areas that require student note-taking or review of text. So for a PE class that does not require note-taking, this would not be a good strategy. But even in a music class or an art class or a language class, if there's note-taking involved or a review of text, whether written, auditory, or visual, this could be a strategy that's adapted for a middle or high school classroom. In our case, the academic language is this: code switching, structured note-taking, the name of the strategy, similarity, difference, cause and effect, power, and dominant monolingual ideology. These aren't usually common words that you're going to be using with one meaning, right? These aren't tier 1. They're more like tier 2 to tier 3 words, especially dominant monolingual ideology. Now, how are we going to use it? What does the strategy call for as far as use? So in this case, academic language is encouraged for use through identification of key terms. So on the handout, they are underlined and highlighted, and a reminder that during the whole group discussion, students should use the academic language. Now, on this handout, I could make that quite small, but it would be a verbal reminder to the class. And finally, application. In our class, we just didn't have time to do this activity, although I've used it in previous classes, and it was effective in fostering analysis of videos as text and the application of the concepts we learned in class. It was also a really good example for the strategy implementation project down the line, what you're doing now, so that students, you, didn't just think that the strategy implementation had to be a written text. In the future, what I might do so that I can incorporate this again might be to include the 30 million word gap module that we explored as a component for watching out of class and then coming into class to discuss it, so that we could use this instrument in class 5 and then again in class 6 as we bridged from thinking about academic discourse in regards to reading and then non-traditional language discourse. So here's my example of the handout. Going to move that over. So here's structured note-taking. Very simple. Ask for your name, Sisti 254, that's our class. You have watched Tequila and the Bee to learn about code switching in the class, power dynamics at play. You've also been shown a clip from the Key and Peele phone call, and do you speak American, African American vernacular in the school? In this activity, you must define code switching, explain when code switching is used, and explain the purposes of code switching. Complete the graphic organizer on these clips. Change that right now. And then engage in an academic conversation about what you noticed using the strategies from Spires and Crawford. And I give you the page numbers to find that. So as you can see, our academic language is underlined and highlighted all the way through. And then, I'm going to move this up so I can get the bottom. You can also see at the very bottom that there's just a little italics line for the whole group discussion after this activity, this paired activity. You'd make sure to use our language, academic language, in our discussion. Just a little reminder for us. So we have a definition for code switching, one definition. The pair would redefine in their own words. We have the 3 texts here that are going to be compared. We're looking for evidence of code switching in these clips all the way through. When, what specific times, why, who demonstrates their power in defining when code switching is used, who has the power, and how does this challenge dominant monolingual ideology? Ideally, I would give this handout to you in a digital form because, of course, handwriting, those are 3 powerful questions, and you might have a lot to put into there. And then, what is the effect of using code switching in these texts? I actually think that it might be beneficial for these questions to be broken out. So what I'm going to do is go through, insert that row above, and put that question right there, just because I think that it'll make it a little cleaner for you all to respond to. And I also think that this one, when is code switching used, it comes in with evidence for code switching. So I'm going to actually take that out. And I think this is also a good practice for you to go through your handout with one other person and say, well, are we asking the same questions more than once? What's specifically needed here? And finally, what are the similarities between these texts? And what are the differences between these texts? I made this a merged box on purpose because I wanted the reminder, yes, that there are 3 distinct visual texts, but to focus on finding the similarities and writing a paragraph on that here. Same with the differences. I would like you all to be working towards synthesis, right? So bringing together your understandings of these 3 different texts to talk about one specific aspect, which are the differences, right? So that's my little tutorial. It does hit on all of the requirements within the guidelines, as you can see here. And again, for our purposes, it didn't make sense to, on the handout for you all, to list all the different key points of the strategy and point out different academic language. But if it does make sense for your students to identify the academic language and to remind them, and perhaps in a word bank at the very top of the handout, and to remind them several times to use that language within their conversation with their partners and in a whole group, then please do use that.